Have you ever tried to read a book like James Joyce's Ulysses and just felt completely, totally lost? Yeah? Well, you've just stumbled headfirst into modernism. It's one of art's most revolutionary and, let's be real, one of its most confusing movements. It's this whole world of fragmented sentences, chaotic scenes, and stories that don't seem to go anywhere. But what if all that chaos actually has a point? Well, today, we're going to try and decode it.
You know the great writer Virginia Woolf? She tried to put this exact feeling into words. And listen to how she describes reading Joyce. She absolutely nails it. She uses words like incoherence and sordidity, but then brilliancy and these flashes of significance. What she's describing is a style that tries to capture thought itself, messy, unfiltered, and totally raw. And that, right there, is the heart of the modernist challenge.
And that really leads us to the big question, right? Why would these brilliant artists just abandon clear plots and straightforward language? I mean, were they just trying to be difficult, or was there something way deeper going on? Well, the short answer is, they weren't just breaking the rules for the sake of it. They were trying to create a whole new language for a world that just didn't make sense anymore.
So, here's our game plan. First, we're going to dig into why modernism felt it had to break all the rules. Then, we'll dive into the wild inner world of the stream of consciousness. After that, we'll see how a shattered world led to shattered art, how artists used ancient myths to find some kind of order, and finally, what this all really shows us about our own world.
All right, Section 1, Why Modernism Broke the Rules. Now, this wasn't some random artistic whim. No, this was a direct, almost explosive reaction to a series of world-shattering events that completely pulled the rug out from under everyone's sense of reality.
It all really starts bubbling up in the late 19th century. On one hand, you've got thinkers like Freud, who's basically revealing this chaotic, unconscious world hiding inside our own heads. And then there's Nietzsche, who declares the death of God, just shaking the very foundations of morality. At the same time, the super-rigid Victorian era is ending, and the moral authority of huge empires starts to crumble. But the real knockout punch, the thing that changed everything, was World War I. A whole generation witnessed industrialized slaughter on a scale no one had ever seen, and it left them with this profound sense of trauma and disillusionment. And you can really see this break when you put the old world right next to the new one. The Victorian world, that was built on these big ideals like strict morals and unwavering faith in progress. The modernists, they just tore that down. They championed the subjective, the individual experience, instead. They started experimenting like crazy because, well, realism just didn't feel real anymore. They became deeply skeptical, arguing that truth wasn't some universal thing, but was actually multiple and deeply personal. So here's the bottom line. The old rules of art, with their neat little plots and their clear morals, they just couldn't capture the feeling of a world that was in total freefall. Modernism had to be born, really, out of a desperate need for a new way to tell the truth about this new chaotic reality. So if the outside world was pure chaos, where could artists possibly turn? Well, the answer was inward. And that brings us to Section 2. Inside the stream of consciousness, this massive turn toward the inner landscape of the mind. This led to one of modernism's absolute signature moves, the stream of consciousness. The whole goal was to show a character's mind, not in some neat, summarized way, but exactly as it happens. A jumble of memories, sensory details, random thoughts, all just tumbling out at once. And Virginia Woolf, once again, she just gives us the perfect mission statement for this. Let us record the atoms as they fall upon the mind. It's all about capturing the raw data of experience before the logical part of our brain has a chance to clean it all up. It's really an attempt to find a deeper, maybe more authentic reality inside our own heads. What's so fascinating, though, is that this wasn't some one-size-fits-all technique. I mean, look at Joyce and Ulysses. He goes for this full-on, unpunctuated flood of thought to show just how unstable our own identities really are. But then you get T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland, and he creates this kind of collective consciousness with all these broken voices reflecting a broken culture. And in his poem Proof Rock, it's much more controlled. A poetic internal monologue that reveals one man's complete psychological paralysis and anxiety. Okay, so this idea of chaos brings us right to our third big concept, a world in shards. Because the chaos wasn't just in the mind, it was everywhere. Modernist artists used a technique called fragmentation to mirror this reality right in the very structure of their work. Fragmentation is, well, it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like, breaking the story into pieces. The plot might jump around in time, the perspective might shift without any warning, even the language itself can feel disjointed. The form of the art is designed to directly mimic the feeling of living in a broken, maybe even spiritually empty world. This one line from T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, it's the key to everything. The fragments, these pieces of memory, of culture, of language, they're all he has left to build something with amidst the ruins of civilization. So you see, fragmentation wasn't just a symptom of collapse. For the modernists, it was also a strategy for survival.
And just like with stream of consciousness, artists use this tool in really different ways. Joyce's fragmentation in Ulysses is stylistic. He literally changes the writing style in every chapter to capture the chaos of one day. Eliot's in The Wasteland is cultural. It's a collage of different languages and voices that shows the collapse of Western tradition. And with Joseph Conrad in Heart of Darkness, the fragmentation is moral. He gives us an unreliable narrator to make us question the very foundations of huge systems like imperialism.
So, if the world is just this chaotic mess of fragments, how in the world do you find any meaning at all? Well, that brings us to our fourth section, myths for a modern age. With all the old certainties gone, modernists looked way back to ancient stories as a way to put some structure back into the chaos. The solution was something T.S. Eliot called the mythical method, and the idea is actually pretty genius. It was to take these timeless patterns you find in ancient myths and use them as a kind of blueprint for a modern story. By drawing a parallel between, say, a character's boring day and Odysseus's epic quest, they could give a sense of order and significance to the fragmented present. But here's the twist. A lot of the time, this was used ironically. Just look at the contrast here. The classic hero, someone like Odysseus, is strong, decisive, on this huge external journey. The modern anti-hero, like Eliot's character Prufrock, is hesitant, anxious, totally socially awkward. His journey is entirely psychological. The heroic myth is used to highlight just how, well, unheroic the modern person felt.
Joyce, for instance, used the myth of the Odyssey to structure Ulysses. And in doing so, he elevates the very ordinary day of his hero Leopold Bloom into something mythic and epic. Eliot used the Fisher-King myth in The Wasteland as a framework to diagnose what he saw as a spiritually barren culture. And in Prufrock, he uses these references to grand figures like Hamlet, but it's ironic. It's to show just how small and inadequate his modern man feels in comparison. So whether it was to elevate, diagnose, or mock, ancient myth became this really powerful tool for making sense of the present.
Okay, so let's try to bring this all together in our final section, what modernism shows us. Because these techniques, stream of consciousness, fragmentation, myth, they weren't just tricks. They were essential tools for building a totally new kind of art for a new kind of world. So when we look back at this whole modernist toolkit, what does it all really add up to? Well, first, all that chaos wasn't random. It was a deliberate, necessary response to a traumatized world. Second, the form of the art became the content. A fragmented world needed fragmented art. Third, the turn inward meant that truth was now seen as something subjective and personal. And finally, and maybe most importantly, underneath all the difficulty and despair was this profound, desperate search for new ways to make meaning. At the end of the day, modernism was so much more than just a style. It was a brave, it was a radical, and it was an unflinchingly honest attempt to capture what it truly felt like to be human in a moment of profound uncertainty. A time when all the old maps had become completely useless. And that kind of leaves us with one last thought. The modernists, they were grappling with what was real in an age of war propaganda and psychological trauma. And today, in our world of social media feeds, deep fakes, and alternative facts, their struggle feels incredibly relevant. It really forces us to ask ourselves, how do we, right now, decide what's real?